Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Armstrong, and I'd like to talk with you about a concept that promises to transform the way that we look at and help students with social and emotional disorders. That concept is neurodiversity. Neurodiversity suggests that we honor and celebrate the diversity of brains among our students in the same way that we honor and celebrate biodiversity and cultural diversity. We don't look at a calla lily and say that it has petal deficit disorder. We honor it for the flower that it is. We don't say of someone who has a skin color that's different from our own that they have a pigmentation disorder. That would be obviously and clearly racist. Similarly, we ought not to be pathologizing and medicalizing individuals who have different ways of thinking, learning, and behavior than typically developing individuals. So this concept of neurodiversity can be really valuable in understanding individuals with emotional and behavioral disorders. In this video, what I'd like to do is share some strategies and tools that you can use that tap these strengths that can help these individuals become more successful in school and life. The first strategy I'd like to suggest, and the most important one, is to find out as much as you can about the strengths, talents, abilities, and interests of students with social, emotional, and behavioral disorders. In fact, what these students often need more than anybody else is someone in their life who sees the best in them and who can draw out the best in them as they struggle with their emotional and behavioral difficulties. So there actually is some important research suggesting that individuals with emotional and behavioral disorders have gifts. Studies have been done, for example, that have looked at artists, writers, and musicians, and a large percentage of them, in fact, did suffer historically from some form of emotional distress or mental illness. A book was written not too long ago by a psychiatrist, Kay Redfield Jamison, called Touched with Fire, where she explored many of those connections between creativity and bipolar disorder, for example. More recently, a study at Stanford University has suggested that children with bipolar disorder, what used to be called manic depressive illness, scored higher on a creativity test than typically developing or quote-unquote normal kids. So there's evidence out there suggesting that these individuals with emotional and behavioral disorders, not all of them, but some of them, are in fact highly creative and affiliated particularly toward the arts. Now, using some learning strategies that are based upon those strengths could include, for example, the expressive arts. I think the expressive art should be used more with all students, but in particular with students who struggle with self-esteem issues and who have creative strengths and potentials. So, for example, after a student has read a novel, they should be able to paint a picture of it to express their feelings. Or in learning a math concept, they should be able to choreograph a dance. I've heard about a student who in fact took the table of periodic elements in high school chemistry and orchestrated a dance around it. We ought to be using more of those innovative tools with kids who have social and emotional difficulties. We also ought to be empowering them with self-help strategies. For example, teaching them how to notice when they're feeling upset, how to de-stress themselves using relaxation, using breathing techniques, using yoga approaches and so forth and so on, meditation. We ought to be providing them with an opportunity at any point during the school day when they're feeling out of control to go to a place, either in the classroom or somewhere in the school, where they can relax, where they can calm themselves, where they can regain control, a kind of a chill-out center. So these are some strategies that can be useful for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. Now, there's some assistive technology tools that can also be very helpful. I think that videotape and photographs can be very useful. Cameras can be very useful with these students. First of all, by giving them these technologies and having them document various parts of the curriculum, go out and interview people, do documentaries as a way of learning content in the curriculum, taking pictures and creating photo essays. But I also think that we as educators can use these technologies to help those students with their behavioral difficulties. I once had a student in my special education classroom who was always throwing tantrums and falling on the floor and flailing about. One day I took a photograph of him during that tantrum, and later on, after he cooled off, I showed him the picture. He never threw a tantrum after that. This gave him a vivid sense of how he was coming across to the classroom, and he realized for the first time that that was what it looked like, and he didn't want to put that out to his classmates, and so he never did it again. We ought to be taking videotapes of our students, both when they're doing something really well and also when they're having difficulty. And we ought to be sitting down with them and watching these videotapes and interacting with the student about how they feel when they see themselves acting out or when they see themselves obeying the rules. And making decisions, making informed decisions about how they want to choose to live their lives and behave and conduct themselves in the school environment. Now, I also think we should be thinking about positive careers for these individuals. There's research out there saying that students with social and emotional difficulties may have more difficulty than people with other disability or diversity categories in finding gainful employment. One area that we could explore is the entertainment industry and the arts, because as we saw earlier, the research suggests that many of these kids are highly creative. Of course, not everybody can do this, and so we ought to be thinking of other careers. I think self-employment may be one possibility, which eliminates the possibility of there being a lot of conflict and friction with an authority figure, a boss, a manager. We also ought to be helping these students form their own career and vocational choices. We ought to be at the high school level, for example, providing them with internships and apprenticeships and opportunities to do job shadowing and other practical experiences so that they can see what works for them and what doesn't, and begin to form a sense of self-determination in terms of how they want to live their lives and what kind of roles they see for themselves, positive roles that they see for themselves out in the world. And for that very same reason, we also ought to be putting out there for them positive role models. People like themselves who had emotional or behavioral disorders, but who managed to minimize their difficulties and maximize their strengths to make the most of what they had. And many of these individuals, in fact, these positive role models, are familiar to us all. Many artists, writers, and musicians, artists like Jackson Pollock, writers like William Faulkner, musicians like Robert Schumann struggled with mental illness. Another really interesting fact is that in one study that was done, it was found that nearly half of all U.S. presidents between 1789 and 1974 suffered from some form of emotional disorder. Lincoln, for example, had depression. Theodore Roosevelt also struggled with emotional distress. Another example is the British leader Winston Churchill, who as a child had a conduct disorder and struggled with his behavior. Finally, another example would be J.K. Rowling, the writer of the Harry Potter series, who herself struggled with depression during her life. So we ought to be putting these positive role models out there so that that child can see and say to themselves, you know, if these people can do it, so can I. I hope that these strategies and tools have been helpful to you. If you want to learn more about these strategies and tools, or get other strategies and tools, or learn more about the research on the strengths of people with emotional and behavioral disorders, get my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom: Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Achieve Success in School and Life. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this presentation, and my wish for you is that your students or your children, if you're parents, realize their full potential by drawing upon their strengths. In order for them to do that, they need to be surrounded by people who see those strengths. And so help them to do that. Help to empower them to become who they really are inside. Thank you very much.